I never imagined a single word could weigh more than sleepless nights, unpaid dreams, and the quiet sacrifices of love. But the day my parents called my baby a burden, I learned how heavy one sentence could be. It was a warm afternoon when I visited them, the kind of day that should have felt hopeful. My baby slept peacefully in my arms, her tiny chest rising and falling in soft rhythm. Her face was calm, unaware of the world's cruelty, unaware of how deeply she was about to be judged by the very people who raised me. We sat in the living room I grew up in. The walls still held old family photos, smiling faces, celebrations, moments when love seemed unconditional. I thought bringing my child there would soften them, remind them of who they once were. I was wrong. My mother looked at the baby and sighed, long and heavy, as if my child had already exhausted her just by existing. "You look tired," she said, not with concern but with judgment. "That's what happens when you ruin your life early." My father added, barely looking up from his phone. I tried to smile. I always tried to smile. Then my mother said it. "This child, she's just a burden on you, on everyone." The word hung in the air like poison. A burden. My arms tightened instinctively around my baby. My heart pounded, but my face stayed still. Years of learning how to survive their disappointment had trained me well. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just nodded, like a child being scolded for something they couldn't undo. Inside, something shattered. They talked on as if they hadn't just crushed something sacred. "You should have waited," my father said. "Now your future is gone," my mother added, "another mouth to feed, another responsibility you clearly weren't ready for." They never once looked at my baby's face. They didn't see the innocence, the miracle, the life I would gladly give everything for. All they saw was inconvenience. What they didn't see was irony, the electricity humming through the room, the fan, the lights, the television, was paid for by me. The groceries in their kitchen, the medication in the cabinet, the rent that kept a roof over their heads. It all came from my sacrifices. From the same irresponsible child they were lecturing. I swallowed hard and said nothing, because explaining myself had never changed their minds before. As my baby stirred, I gently rocked her, whispering soft reassurances, not to her, she slept soundly, but to myself. "You are not a mistake. You are not a burden," but the words from my parents echoed louder. Growing up, I was always the one expected to understand. To compromise, to give. Love to them was conditional, earned through obedience and usefulness. And somehow, even after becoming a parent myself, I was still chasing their approval. That day, sitting in their living room, I felt smaller than I ever had. Not because I doubted myself, but because I finally saw them clearly. They didn't ask how I was managing. They didn't ask if I needed help. They didn't ask if I was happy. They only saw what I could no longer give freely without losing myself. When I stood to leave, my mother shook her head. "You'll realize one day," she said, "how hard you've made life." I looked down at my baby, her tiny hand wrapping around my finger, trusting me completely. "No," I thought, "this is the hardest and most beautiful thing I've ever done." As I walked out, I didn't know yet that their words would change everything. I didn't know that this moment their cruelty, their ignorance was the beginning of the end of my silence. But I knew one thing with painful clarity. If they thought my baby was a burden, they had no idea who had truly been carrying whom all these years. People often say that becoming a parent changes you. They talk about love growing deeper, patience stretching wider, fear becoming sharper. What they don't talk about enough is how quietly you learn to disappear for everyone else. After my baby was born, my world shrank to late, night feedings and morning worries. Every cry sent panic through my chest, not because she was difficult, but because I was terrified of failing her. I promised myself one thing: no matter how heavy life became, she would never feel unwanted the way I had. Money became my constant calculation. While other people my age posted pictures of vacations and celebrations, I learned how to survive on the bare minimum. I skipped meals so I could buy diapers. I wore old clothes so my baby could have new ones. And in the middle of all of that, I kept sending money to my parents. Quietly, faithfully, without question. Every month, before paying my own bills, I paid theirs. Rent first. Electricity second, groceries after that. When my father needed medicine, I sent extra. When my mother complained about prices rising, I adjusted my budget again. They never asked how I managed. They assumed I always would. Sometimes at night, I would sit on the floor beside my baby's crib, my phone glowing in the dark as I checked my bank balance. The numbers frightened me, but I told myself it was temporary, that family was family, that love meant sacrifice. What I didn't realize was that sacrifice without appreciation slowly turns into erasure. My parents spoke proudly to relatives about how well they were doing. God has been kind, my father would say, we manage on our own. My mother would add, I listened in silence. When they compared me to other people's children, children who bought cars for their parents or built houses, I swallowed my hurt. They never mentioned that I was the reason they slept peacefully at night, free from overdue notices and disconnection warnings. Instead, they reminded me of my mistake. You chose this life, my mother would say, glancing at my baby. You should suffer the consequences, as if love were a punishment, as if my child were a debt instead of a blessing. There were moments I wanted to scream the truth, to tell them everything, to force them to see me. But something held me back. Maybe hope, maybe fear, maybe the foolish belief that one day they would realize it on their own. I didn't want gratitude, I wanted respect. I wanted them to look at my baby and see strength, not shame. I wanted them to look at me and see a parent who stepped up, not a child who failed. Instead, every sacrifice I made became invisible the moment it left my hands. One evening, my baby fell asleep on my chest after hours of crying. I didn't move, afraid to wake her, even though my arms ached. In that quiet moment, tears slid down my face, not because of exhaustion, but because I finally admitted the truth to myself. I was doing too much for people who gave too little. My parents had built their comfort on my silence, on my guilt, on my need to be good enough for them, and the cruelest part, they called my baby a burden, while never realizing she was the only reason I hadn't broken completely. As I gently laid her in her crib, I made a decision I didn't yet fully understand. I would keep protecting my child, but I would no longer destroy myself to protect people who refused to see my worth. I didn't know how or when things would change. I only knew they couldn't stay the same. The truth has a strange way of waiting. It stays quiet, patient, buried beneath habits and assumptions until the moment it is needed most. For me, that moment arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, wrapped in urgency and accusation. My phone rang just as I finished feeding my baby. I balanced her on my shoulder, gently patting her back when I saw my father's name on the screen. His calls were never casual. "We have a problem," he said the second I answered. No greeting, no concern. The landlord came again. The electricity company sent another notice. Fix it, not please. Not can you help, just fix it. In the background, my baby began to cry, tired and hungry again. My mother's voice cut through the noise. "Why is she always crying?" she snapped. "See, always trouble." Something in me went very still. For the first time, I didn't rush. I didn't apologize. I didn't promise anything. I sat down slowly, holding my baby close, feeling her warmth against my chest. "I won't be paying any more," I said quietly. There was a sharp pause. "What do you mean?" my father asked. His voice hardened like I had just insulted him. "I mean exactly that," I replied. "I'm done." My mother laughed, but there was panic underneath it. "Don't be dramatic. Just send the money like you always do. Like I always do. For years, I had been invisible labor. Reliable, silent, expected, and now for the first time I was stepping out of that role. "You can't do this," my father said. "We're counting on you." I closed my eyes. "That's the problem," I said. "You always have." They began talking over each other, complaints, accusations, reminders of everything they had ever done for me. I let them speak, let the words spill out, because when they finally stopped, the truth had space to breathe. "I've been paying your bills," I said calmly, "all of them, for years." Silence crashed down on the line. I told them everything: the rent, the electricity, the groceries, the medicine, every transfer, every skipped meal. Every night I lay awake calculating how to survive another month. I did it while you called my baby a burden. I continued while you told me I ruined my life. My father's voice dropped to a whisper. We thought you were struggling. I was. I said, you just never cared enough to ask. My mother started crying. Not softly, loudly, dramatically. We didn't know, she said. Why didn't you tell us? I almost laughed. Because every time I tried to explain myself, you told me it was my fault. I said, because I learned that my pain made you uncomfortable. They had no answers. Only shame. For the first time in my life, the power shifted. Not because I raised my voice, but because I finally told the truth without fear. I'm choosing my child now, I said. I should have done that sooner. They begged, they apologized. They promised to change, but something inside me had already crossed a line. After I ended the call, I held my baby and cried not out of weakness, but relief. The secret was out. The weight I had carried alone was finally set down. I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. And freedom, I realized, was something they could never give me, but something they could no longer take away. They came 3 days later. Not with demands this time, not with complaints or instructions. They stood at my door quietly, uncertain, like strangers who had forgotten the rules of the house they once owned. My mother's eyes were red. My father looked older, somehow smaller. I let them in. My baby was lying on a blanket on the floor, kicking her legs happily, unaware that she had become the center of a family reckoning. My mother hesitated before kneeling beside her. For the first time, she didn't sigh. She didn't criticize. She just stared. She's beautiful. She whispered. I said nothing. We sat in silence for a long moment. No one rushed to fill it. I had spent my whole life trying to make things comfortable for them. Now, I let the quiet do the work. Finally, my father spoke. We failed you, he said, his voice rough. We took you for granted. My mother nodded, tears slipping down her face. We were cruel, she added, calling your child a burden. I don't know how you forgave us long enough to keep helping. I didn't forgive you, I said gently. I endured you. The words surprised even me, but they felt honest, clean. I told them what I needed, not money, not apologies repeated until they lost meaning, but boundaries. Respect, space to raise my child without shame hanging over her like a shadow. I won't abandon you, I said. But I won't destroy myself for you either. They agreed quickly, too quickly. Guilt has a way of making people promise everything. But this wasn't about promises anymore, it was about choice. After they left, I sat on the floor beside my baby and watched her play. She grabbed my finger and laughed, a sound so pure it felt like healing stitched into the air. In that moment, I understood something with perfect clarity. My revenge wasn't cutting them off. It wasn't watching them struggle. It wasn't saying, now you know how it feels. My revenge was survival with softness intact. I had protected them while they misunderstood me. Now I would protect my child by teaching her something different, what love looks like when it isn't conditional. What family means when it doesn't demand silence as payment. Weeks passed, my parents learned to manage on their own. They called less. When they did, their voices were careful, respectful. They asked about the baby. Sometimes my mother asked if she could visit. Sometimes I said yes, sometimes I said no, and for the first time in my life, no didn't feel like a crime. One evening, as I rocked my baby to sleep, I thought about the word that started everything, burden. I smiled sadly. This tiny human had pushed me to speak, to stand, to stop shrinking. She had cost me comfort, but given me courage. She had demanded more of me, and in doing so, saved me. If that was a burden, then it was one I would gladly carry. As I laid her down, I whispered a promise into the quiet room. You will never have to earn your place in my life. You already belong. And in that promise, I healed parts of myself my parents never knew they broke. That was the sweetest revenge of all.